So go ahead and tell us, Jean, what you remember on that day of December 7th.
I can remember being at home with my parents, and it was a Sunday evening, and all of a sudden we heard some yelling out in the street. We lived on 46th Avenue in Gary at that time in San Francisco, and some young voice was yelling out in the street, "Extra, extra." So we opened the door and looked outside, and it was a young boy carrying newspapers, and he was yelling, "Extra, extra." So we bought the newspaper just to see what was going on, and the headline was that Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese earlier that morning, apparently about 8 o'clock in the morning, Honolulu time. We didn't have the radio on at that time, so therefore we also turned on the radio to hear some of the details. The details were horrible from what they were saying because so much damage had been done there. So it was quite a shock, and that brought the United States into a conflict with a war that had started 3 years earlier in Europe.
Okay.
Okay.
So, Jean, how did that directly affect your family and the people around you?
Well, it not only affected the family, the people around me, but it affected everyone in the United States, as there was certainly disbelief that the United States could be so vulnerable and be attacked like that. And now it was necessary to defend ourselves and win this war that was foisted upon us. At that time, the United States had a very small standing army, and all young men up to about the age of 35 were drafted at home. Significant changes took place over the next few weeks. There was fright that we would be bombed. If the Japanese could bomb Pearl Harbor, why couldn't they bomb the West Coast? So we instigated blackouts where you had to black out your windows so no light would go through. They instigated block wardens to watch over the people in case there were difficulties, panic. They instituted fire wards. My dad always had an inkling of being a fireman, so we had a firehouse 5 blocks away, so he went there and volunteered. Ultimately, and I have a picture of it somewhere at home, they gave him a blue overcoat, and they gave him a little badge that said auxiliary fireman. Then there was a great deal of work to ramp up what to do. Everything became a shortage because all raw materials and many of the everyday goods had to be saved. They had to be recycled. They had to go to the government. And shortly afterwards followed us a rationing system. They established an office of price administration, and everybody got little booklets, and these little booklets had stamps, pieces of paper that you would tear out that had a value. If you wanted to buy a can of peas, it cost you 6 points. If you wanted to buy a can of bacon, it was 25 points. For meats, they used red plastic coupons, and they used blue ones for vegetables. And all sorts of things became rationed. Gasoline was one. They instituted stamps that you put on your windshield, A, B, and C. I can remember, and then there was another one for taxis. A was everyday usage. You got about 2 gallons of gasoline a week. B was for essential workers. My dad was a baker, so they acknowledged that growing food in the food chain was a necessity because he was too old to be drafted. So he got a B coupon, which was enough to provide gasoline. He had to drive about 10 miles one way to work, so that was 20 miles a day. Didn't leave you much gasoline to do any private sightseeing, but we didn't have any difficulty. Of course, San Francisco still had streetcars, so you could move around the city. Tires were unbelievably difficult to obtain. They just weren't available. A lot of business got started there with recapping tires. But then the government wanted private citizens to save all their collectible tin or iron. Tin cans had to be flattened out and put in a box by the curb with your garbage to be picked up once a week. I can remember also suet or fat, lard was required. They wanted you to put it out for recycling. And of course, clothing was available, but for some reason or another, shoes were rationed, which to me seemed kind of strange. But I guess it must be because of a shortage of leather. A lot of leather at that time came from the hide of animals. I don't know if there was any rubber at that time, maybe rubber soles and things of that nature, so that became important. But as a child, the following month I became 12. That was January of 1942, and I didn't see anything really unusually wrong. I had always had plenty to eat at home with food. My parents always managed to have enough stamps to buy what was needed. I didn't wear out shoes too much, so clothing was not a problem. One of the downsides would be that you obviously could not travel because there were buses, but there was no place to go. A lot of places were closed, and you couldn't always find gasoline because a lot of service stations just simply went out of business there with the rationing.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, so my papa in Belgium, Alex's grandpa, was born in 1928, and you were born in 31?
1930.
In 1930.
2 years later.
Oh, that's right. And Papa in Belgium tells a completely different story than you do, but you were also born in Europe, correct?
That's right. I was born in the southern part of France in the Pyrenees, in the department of l'Ariège, which butts up against Andorra and Spain.
Okay, and did your family have difficulties over there, the remainder of your relatives? Did they express anything that was going on?
My parents communicated by letter at that time because there was no telephone service, but they would be in contact with my parents in southern France. But my parents lived on my father's side. He was a butcher and ran a catering business. On my mother's side, they were basically military and farmers, and being in the butcher business, he was involved with cattle and agriculture and farming and whatnot. This is rural France, and they had difficult times. That they didn't starve, but they weren't getting fat. I can remember my cousin on my mother's side one time telling me that growing up he yearned for a roll, a piece of bread. and he didn't have it. But the Germans, yes, they were in the southern France, but not to the extent that they occupied the country like in the northern part. The country was, after the Germans overran the country, they kind of divided the country and called it Vichy France. So that in the southern part, there was very, very limited German occupancy. They were concentrated in the north and building the facilities along the northern shore in anticipation of an attack. So they lived on a farm, so they had access to chickens and things of this nature. Germans would come through occasionally and demand food, and they would help themselves to some of the animals. That seems to be a natural consequence of warfare when you have to supply your occupying, your attacking forces.
But they were never bombed directly.
They were never bombed directly. No. There was no bombing in southern France.
Well, Papa tells me in his city, they bombed and people drowned in the basements because they were hiding, and the water pipes would break and flood the basement, and that was one of the biggest tragedies that he remembered.
Well, following World War One, France built a so-called Maginot Line with a lot of defenses, and this faced the German border. The Germans on the other side built their own line, the Siegfried line, so that the two walls faced each other. France anticipating that in the future in another war, Germany would attack their Maginot Line, which they felt was incredible and couldn't be overcome. But the Germans realizing that, what did they do? They outflanked the Maginot Line and they went through Belgium. They outflanked the Maginot Line and went through Belgium and went through northern France and swept into Paris. And the Maginot Line was nothing. It was a flop.
Good morning, Jean.
Good morning, Phyllis. A pleasure to be here in Elk Grove this crispy December morning.
Yes, and it's December 7th, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, isn't it?
It is. I believe that this is 2021 and it occurred in 1941. That means that it's kind of one of these decade celebrations. It's the 80th.
It sure is.
Yeah.
And you were 11 that year.
I was 11 and 11 months old when this attack occurred.
Well, I remember talking to my father-in-law in Belgium. This is Papa. He was born in 1928, and he would tell me some different things about what happened in that era. And now I'd like for you to give me your ideas of what you remember happened. Well, Jean, I remember the people in Europe so grateful for the participation of the Americans during this situation. What do you remember about that?
Well, they were really flabbergasted that France could collapse in a matter of days. And they were really shell-shocked, and Germany swept through the northern part of France, occupied Paris, and the United States obviously was helpless, couldn't do anything at that particular time. And Germany then threatened Great Britain because Great Britain is a small island, and they had no support, no help from any European country. the United States, not wanting to get involved in the war, did do everything they could to help Great Britain, and the president at that time, President Roosevelt, instigated a program that was known as Lend-Lease, in which the United States loaned 50 destroyers to Great Britain, and also provided them with much war material, supplies, and food. Getting around the law at that time, it became known as Lend-Lease, and what Great Britain did in kind to repay. They did not repay in monetary funds, but they allowed the United States to occupy various bases in the Western Hemisphere and other places where Great Britain had a colony or an occupancy. So that helped at that point. When you speak of the French people being so helpful and appreciative, I can only cite one instance that I was involved in many years ago, and that was when I visited Normandy. I visited Normandy for the first time in 1996 with my wife, and we spent time in Normandy. We visited all the landing beaches. D-Day at that time was June 6th, 1944. And one of the incidents that made major impact was when the paratroopers parachuted into Normandy, particularly the ones that parachuted over l'église Saint-Mère d'Église. And one of the parachuters got trapped and hung from a church spire. And he hung there, and the Germans fired at him. They injured his foot. Ultimately, he was pulled out through a window and later escaped. But the man's name was John Steele. And there's a picture that is shown almost every year on D-Day, the longest day, and his role was played by Red Buttons. But John Steele became such an icon in this village that for years he would return with family, and the locals would honor him as a hero. And Mike and I would go in the delicatessens, the stores, and we would buy wine, and we would buy cheese and talk to some of the merchants, and they were all bubbling over and talking and telling stories about that time.
It's for sure a day to remember.
Saint-Mère d'Église, and I've been to Normandy 3 times now, and it's always enjoyable. It's always a somber occasion, particularly walking the beaches and walking among all the 9,000 plus graves at Courville-sur-Mer, the American cemetery.
Wow. Well, Jean, you and I go back a little bit. We met in China in 2006 when we went on my first tour with the Flying Tiger boys that were honored by the diplomats and dignitaries of China. And you had been already before me, and then we went and met again the next year. But tell me a little bit about that.
The Flying Tiger tour?
Yeah, how we came together, how we met.
Well, let's see, this would be in the early 2000s. My wife and I had been to China on the Yangtze River cruise once in the late 1990s, which was enjoyable, particularly so in view of later events because there was no dam that was present or being constructed, although they were talking about it at the Three Gorges. But I would run across ads that were run by this organization out of Groveland, California, that was promoting China tours, basically for clientele that was oriented with flying. And somehow or other, they had interjected, whether it was a teaser or not, the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers are an American volunteer group that flew for China during the period of December 1941 until July of 1942, when they were disbanded and merged into a United States military air force. So it sounded very interesting, and the itinerary was wonderful with the big cities, so we got the information and we signed up for it, and it was, I believe, in March of 2006. It could have been February, but I think it was March. And a wonderful group. I can remember there had to be close to 200 people, maybe not quite that many, but I know we had a slew of buses. Considering the magnitude of it, I think it was about 17 or 18 days. It was magnificently coordinated. A couple of hiccups now and then where a meal maybe might not have been exactly what we expected, but trying to organize in a tour in China, I think, is a real Herculean effect. And I think the only reason they were really able to do it because they worked so closely with K.C. Ma. K.C. Ma was a vice president with the Tourist Bureau in China. He had an office in Chinatown, San Francisco. He was with us on the tour, and he kind of was the point guard on this and made sure that everything was as pleasant as possible. Tremendous tour, well organized. We saw so many interesting things and met many people. Dinners in China with the restaurants. Many of the meals are with kind of family style because you're sitting at a round table with lazy Susans with the food passing back and forth. So you're essentially, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you're really forced to converse with people at the table there, which makes it nice. But it was wonderful, and I never met anybody at that time. There was nobody from Las Cruces or New Mexico that I remember being on the tour, but it was enjoyable, and I wanted to go again. So the following year, it came up. This was an annual tour that Larry and Nina put on, and I told them I wanted to go, and I went. And funny things happened on that tour. Somehow or other, there were too many people for the Air China flight, and Nina said, "I've got you booked on a United flight, and that'll be leaving a couple of hours earlier, but then you'll be in Shanghai waiting for the rest of the tour." And so, okay, so apparently there was a group of about maybe 15 of us who were part of the larger group who were on the United flight. We got to Shanghai in the evening, had dinner, and went to bed. I wasn't aware whether or not the main body had arrived yet or not, but the following morning, well, I went down to breakfast and was walking through the tour, and I guess we were late for breakfast because I was walking through the tour, getting ready over to the chow line when somebody yelled "Chin, Chin," I turned around and looked to who the hell knows my name in Shanghai. And, you know, I don't know anybody in Shanghai.
Lo and behold, it was me.
And then it was this wonderful person, Phyllis, who remembered me from the year before, it turned out that Phyllis enjoyed the trip too, so much so that she ran her own tour and organized her own tour, and they recognized this, and they gave Phyllis, as a quasi tour guide, her own bus
Yes, they
to
did.
maintain. So
Yes, they did.
we saw her almost daily. She had her own group to watch over. So, but we did visit and laugh over it and whatnot, and that set the friendship that was born.
It sure
It was
did.
born on that second time. Otherwise, I would have never, known.
We have so many common interests.
Yeah.
Okay, Jean. Well, we met in China, and you were discussing how you saw me at breakfast. And on that particular tour, it started in Beijing and then went to Shanghai and then went to Suzhou to see the Grand Canal. And from Suzhou, we went to Wuhan and did the Yangtze River tour. And then we ended up after that in Chongqing, one of the biggest cities in the world with 55 million people at that time. And then some of the highlights were Xi'an, where the terracotta soldiers were. Can you explain about that?
Yeah, that's an eighth wonder of the world, the terracotta warriors. Relatively new discovery. It's amazing. It's a real young event. They discovered them either in the year 1972 or 1974 when a couple of local farmers needed to drill a well. And so they started digging, and they ran into some pieces of something that they were not familiar with. It wasn't, they thought it might have been pieces of rock, but then as they dug, they started finding pieces that looked like arms or legs. And at that point, they decided that they better stop and call the local authorities. And they came, roped it off, and started doing their own investigation and digging, and they encountered this, eventually what turned out to be a huge army of soldiers. And they have something like 7,000 or 8,000 of them that they found. Not only soldiers, but horses and carriages and war machines and things of that nature. When we were there, it's very well presented now. You enter what is a very large airplane hangar, and you see rows and rows facing you of soldiers. And you can tell by distinctive appearances that they are different types of soldiers. Some of them are basic soldiers, others carry bow and arrows, other poles, various weapons, and there seems to be a distinction between an average soldier and an officer. So it turns out to be a huge army, and they call them pits over there, and they have 3 or 4. The main one is pit number 1, but they're also continuing to excavate and find more and more of these people. So it looks like they have a lifetime of work there ahead of them to try to finally determine the excess of it, but it's extremely interesting. When my wife and I were there in the late 1990s, you could observe them, but you were forbidden to take pictures of them. You couldn't take pictures of them, and you couldn't make a circular tour around them. In subsequent years, when we were with the Flying Tiger aviators, you could take all the pictures that you wanted, and you could walk around. You couldn't walk down into the pits, but you could walk around the entire facility and then go on to the other 2 or 3 pits that they had. The others were smaller. They seemed to be deeper.
And this was from the Ming Dynasty?
Well, one of those dynasties, I don't know, it's the, I would assume it's the Ming Dynasty.
And they were there because the emperor wanted to have protection in the afterlife, right?
He wanted to be protected in the afterlife, and he wanted this army, and this is what they went and did. An extraordinary discovery.
Well, I forgot to mention when we did finish the Yangtze River, we went to Chongqing, and there was the Chennault Museum, General Chennault Museum.
Yes, he was the general in charge of the China-Burma-India theater of World War II, so he has his museum there, and then the Flying Tigers, who did quite a bit in southern China fighting the Japanese Air Force, have their own museum there also.
Because our tour was in regards to the Flying Tigers, where was it that we saw the military hideout in a cave, which now is made into a museum? But when we were there, it was just a bare cave.
Yeah, that was in the city of Guilin. And they took us out to the airfield that was used by the Flying Tigers, and at the end of the runway there's a small mountain with a cave in it, and this was the headquarters, a cave that was the headquarters for General Chennault, who directed the activities of his Tigers and his Air Force there. The runway was built manually by the Chinese without using any mechanical equipment. They would roll rocks out there, and they would just trot on them back and forth.
We ended up meeting one of the persons that helped build that runway.
Yes, tour director Larry Job had arranged to have several, apparently, of the local peasants who had worked on that, and they had a few words to say, and various members of the group had a chance, an opportunity to ask them questions about how things were at that time. That was about 60 years earlier, and it was fascinating to hear their grasp on it. And at that time, an announcement was made that they were going to try to do something with this cave to preserve the historic presence of it. And they announced at that time that they were going to try to erect some type of monument to the situation at that time, promoting and describing what the Flying Tigers did to promote that city.
That was in Guilin, where we went down the Li River.
The Li River was
all those crags in the water are so spectacular and dramatic.
The mountains there, just unbelievable, one right after another. And the Li River, that was an enjoyable cruise. Yeah, it was just one ship after another going down, and it was one. The scenery was just wonderful.
Well, sweetheart, thank you for the interview.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
I sure appreciate it. I always love it when you come to visit me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Never a
You're-
dull moment.
You're always so kind and hospitable.
Okay, Jean. Well, today is December 7th, 2021, and we are going to talk about when we were in Wuhan before and how that coincides with today's pandemic about the coronavirus. So let's hear something about that.
Well, this is interesting because when we embark on a Yangtze River cruise, we go upstream, but the starting point is at a large Chinese city by the name of Wuhan, and the tour arrives in Wuhan in the morning. So we have a nice tour of the city. We have a great lunch. We see the big tower there. And then in the late afternoon, after going to a museum, we go down to the river and we get on our boat, and the boat will leave in the morning. It's always a pleasure, and they really make it interesting for you, because I can remember as we walk on the boat there, they have dancers and people there banging drums and whatnot, and it's quite festive. But that's interesting. So twice with the Flying Tigers, I've been to Wuhan, and earlier with my wife. We don't think about it after the tour. We don't think about it too much. Just another city like Beijing and Shanghai and Xi'an. But all of a sudden, early 2020, a certain malady starts creeping into the United States, and it develops that it's a new virus. And they're trying to determine, well, how did this happen? Where did it come from? And they finally said that apparently they feel that the Chinese don't admit it, but we feel that it finally emerged one way or another from a laboratory of virology in, of all places, Wuhan, China. So this is amazing. It's in the news, and we've had the pleasure of being there several times. This becomes really interesting and a point of conversation when I have the opportunity to talk to friends at a Friday night dinner or elsewhere, and naturally the topic of COVID comes up and where it came from and how the Chinese are trying to ignore it or disclaim any responsibility and from this lab in Wuhan, and I'm able to say that yeah, I've been there not once, not twice, but 3 times, and people are really surprised by that.
Well, I remember when we were in Guilin going to that cave to check out the military hideout, we had to pass through a chicken farm. And at that time, bird flu was a little bit in the news, and we had to make sure that we cleaned our shoes off to be rid of any feces that we might have walked in, or we were aware that it could be problematic. Do you remember that?
I sure do. It was a long building, just wire cages, fences and whatnot, but. Rhode Island, I think they were Rhode Island chickens. There was just a slew of them. And that's about all that there was out there. We could see the airfield, and I can remember one of the flying Tigers saying that he had flown out of that airfield, but he had never been in the cave.
Uh-huh.
He'd never been in the cave, and the cave was what more or less a secret.
A secret, yeah.
Because that's what they ran the operation out of. It was very primitive by today's standards. And
So we've been aware of these viruses for quite a while, and we know that they're started by animals, or you come in close contact with animals. It's a possibility of getting this. So this
Yeah.
isn't something really new. It's just more vastly spread around now because of probably travel, and the age of information gives us this opportunity to learn about it quicker than it might have been in the past.
well, one of the possible causes they promote is that, hey, this occurred at a wet market. They have wet markets in China, and this is where they have various types of live animals and birds and bats and all kinds of weird things that you normally see in a zoo and whatnot. And they butcher these animals and sell them to customers, and customers come to buy them. So they claim that possibly that's how it emerged. But at the same time, now it develops that the United States has funded some activities that, through a third party, have gone to this lab in Wuhan and to do some kind of research. But what kind of research do they do there when they're dealing with such dangerous aspects of various viruses? So they think that possibly it was an accident that escaped the lab. That's one possibility, and then of course the wet market theory. But
Well, we can be very blessed that we live in a country that we can voice our opinion or our ideas on different subjects, where in other countries it would be dangerous to do so.
yeah. Well, there was one Chinese dissident who claimed before it became apparent that there was a danger, that something had happened at this lab, that certain Chinese personnel had become sick and died, but they tempered it down and denied everything. And the Chinese have never been wholehearted in investigating it, and the WHO, World Health Organization, also tried to get to the bottom of it, but it's basically still up in the air, and we, of course, in our government, I think, are still investigating it, but investigations out of Washington seem to take an eternity.
And that guy died. The guy that wanted to discuss it
Yes.
openly.
Yes, he died. He
Yeah.
died. So,
Okay then.
all
well,
right. So,
In the day of December 7th, we're talking today and discussing all the things that we've experienced together in a small way, but I'm so happy to have these conversations with you, and I want to thank you very much.
oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure. Thank you for your wonderful introductions and hospitality. A pleasure.